August 27, 1816, the harbour of Algiers. For 2 centuries, the Barbary Corsairs had terrorized the Mediterranean, capturing European ships, enslaving Christian crews, demanding tribute from terrified nations. Behind the walls of Algiers, 3,000 men, women and children sat in chains, Christian slaves suffering in North African prisons while their governments paid ransoms they couldn't afford. Every major European power had tried negotiation. They'd paid tribute. They'd begged. They'd offered diplomatic compromises. The Dey of Algiers, the ruler of this Corsair state, had rejected every demand to free the slaves. He believed himself untouchable. His harbour was protected by massive shore batteries mounting over 1,000 cannon. His fleet of 50 Corsair ships dominated the western Mediterranean. And behind him stood the Ottoman Empire, nominal overlords who'd turned a blind eye to centuries of piracy and slavery. Then a British fleet appeared on the horizon. 5 ships of the line, a dozen frigates, one ageing admiral with a simple message: free the slaves or we'll destroy you. This is the story of the bombardment of Algiers, Britain's moral crusade, the 9-hour battle that ended 200 years of Mediterranean slavery, and the day when one nation finally said, enough, welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into the battle that proved Britain's abolition of the slave trade wasn't just about economics or politics. It was about moral conviction, backed by naval power. Because what happened at Algiers in 1816 showed the world that Britain would use its fleet not just to defend its interests, but to free slaves who weren't even British citizens. But before we get to those 9 hours of bombardment, before we watch Royal Navy ships face point-blank fire from shore batteries and burn the Corsair fleet to ashes, we need to understand how the Barbary states turned piracy and slavery into a 2-century-old institution. Because without knowing what Algiers represented, you can't appreciate why Britain finally decided to end it by force. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We cover the battles that shaped Britain, the victories that built an empire, the moments when British courage changed the world. Don't miss them. Let's go back to the 16th century, when the Ottoman Empire's expansion into North Africa created what Europeans called the Barbary states: Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Morocco. These weren't traditional colonies. They were semi-autonomous pirate kingdoms operating under Ottoman protection, their economies built entirely on capturing Christian ships and enslaving Christian crews. The system was brutally efficient. Barbary Corsairs, fast, well-armed ships crewed by experienced sailors, would patrol the Mediterranean and even venture into the Atlantic, hunting for merchant vessels. When they found one, they'd board it, kill anyone who resisted, and take everyone else as slaves. The captives would be marched to Algiers or Tunis, where they'd be sold in slave markets or held for ransom. If you were wealthy or important, your family might pay your ransom and you'd go home. If you were a common sailor or a poor merchant, you'd spend years in slavery, rowing in Corsair galleys, building fortifications, working in quarries. Some converted to Islam to improve their treatment. Others died in captivity. Women faced even worse fates, sold into harems or household slavery. This wasn't small-scale piracy. Historians estimate that between 1530 and 1780, Barbary Corsairs captured over 1 million European Christians and enslaved them. 1 million. Entire coastal villages in Italy, Spain, and even England were raided, their populations carried off to North Africa. In 1631, Corsairs raided Baltimore in Ireland and enslaved the entire village, over 100 people who would never see home again. European nations paid tribute to avoid having their ships captured. It was cheaper to pay annual protection money than to fight the Corsairs. Britain paid tribute, France paid, the Dutch paid. Even the newly independent United States paid. President Jefferson famously tried to negotiate with the Barbary states, failed, and eventually sent the US Marines to the shores of Tripoli in 1805. But by 1816 the world was changing. Napoleon had been defeated at Waterloo the year before. Britain's Royal Navy was the most powerful fleet in history, unchallenged on any ocean. And most importantly, Britain had banned the slave trade in 1807 and was increasingly convinced that all forms of slavery were morally wrong. This wasn't just political posturing. The abolition movement in Britain was driven by genuine moral conviction, by men like William Wilberforce, who'd spent decades arguing that slavery was a sin against God and humanity. Once Britain banned its own slave trade, British abolitionists began asking, if slavery is wrong, why are we allowing the Barbary states to continue enslaving Christians? In March 1816, Britain sent Lord Exmouth, Admiral Edward Pellew, to negotiate with the Barbary states. Exmouth was 58 years old, a veteran of decades of naval warfare. He'd fought against the French throughout the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. He'd captured dozens of enemy ships, survived desperate battles, and commanded fleets in the Mediterranean. He was experienced, respected, and absolutely committed to the abolitionist cause. Exmouth's mission was simple: sail to Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli with a small squadron and convince the rulers to free their Christian slaves and stop capturing European ships. He succeeded in Tunis and Tripoli. Their rulers, seeing British determination, agreed to free most of their slaves and sign treaties ending their participation in the slave trade. But Algiers was different. The Dey of Algiers, Omar Aga, was arrogant, confident in his city's defences, and unwilling to negotiate. When Exmouth demanded the release of all Christian slaves, Omar Aga refused. He saw no reason to comply. Britain might be powerful at sea, but Algiers was impregnable on land. Its massive harbour fortifications had never been seriously challenged. And if Britain tried to attack, well, Omar Aga would simply kill the slaves and dare the British to do their worst. Exmouth sailed back to England in May 1816 and reported to the Admiralty. Negotiation had failed. If Britain wanted to end Barbary slavery, it would have to do so by force. The British government made a decision that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. They ordered Exmouth to assemble a fleet, return to Algiers, and destroy its defences. Not conquer the city. That would require tens of thousands of troops Britain didn't want to commit, but destroy its ability to wage piracy, burn the Corsair fleet, wreck the harbour fortifications, show the Dey of Algiers that British naval power could reach anywhere and destroy anything that stood against British moral authority. Exmouth assembled his fleet at Plymouth. 5 ships of the line, the massive 3-decked warships that were the capital ships of the age, 14 frigates and smaller warships, 4 bomb vessels carrying mortars, nearly 200 guns and 3,000 sailors and marines. It wasn't the largest fleet ever assembled, but it was more than enough for what Exmouth intended. The plan was audacious. Exmouth would sail directly into Algiers harbour, within point-blank range of the shore batteries, and engage in what naval officers called a pounding match. Ships against forts, British gunnery, and discipline against North African numbers and position. It was the kind of battle that could go catastrophically wrong. If British ships grounded in the shallows, they'd be battered to pieces by cannon fire from multiple directions. If fires spread out of control, ships could explode. If the wind shifted wrong, the entire fleet could be trapped. But Exmouth believed that British sailors, trained to fight in all conditions, disciplined in their gunnery, experienced in close-quarters battle, could win even at these odds. And more importantly, he believed the cause was worth the risk. 3,000 Christian slaves needed rescue. 2 centuries of piracy needed to end. And Britain was the only nation with the naval power and moral conviction to do it. One detail is worth noting. Exmouth invited other European nations to join the attack. The Dutch sent a squadron of 5 frigates and a corvette under Admiral van der Capellen, eager to strike back against the Corsairs who'd plagued Dutch shipping for generations. Other nations sent observers but no ships. They wanted to see if Britain could succeed before committing their own forces. On August 9th, Exmouth's fleet left Gibraltar and sailed east toward Algiers. The crews knew what was coming. Sailors wrote letters home, chaplains held services, surgeons prepared their instruments. Everyone understood this would be one of the most dangerous naval operations in decades. By August 27th, the fleet was off Algiers. Exmouth sent a boat to the harbour, carrying a final message: release the slaves immediately, or face destruction. The Dey's response was defiant. He would never surrender to Christian demands. If the British wanted the slaves, they could try to take them by force. At 2:45 p.m, with the wind favourable and the afternoon light still strong, Exmouth gave the order to advance. The fleet entered Algiers harbour in line, each ship carefully positioned to bring maximum firepower to bear on specific targets. HMS Queen Charlotte, Exmouth's flagship, a massive three-decker mounting 100 guns, anchored within 50 yards of the Algerian flagship and the heaviest shore battery. Other British ships took position along the harbour mole, facing the fortifications at ranges so close that gunners could see individual enemy gunners through the smoke. At 3:15 p.m, the British opened fire. Every gun that could bear unleashed broadsides into the Algerian defences. The roar was deafening. Algiers had never experienced bombardment like this. British ships of the line carried 32-pounder and 24-pounder guns, firing solid shot that could punch through stone fortifications. At this range, less than 100 yards in many cases, every shot told. The Algerians fired back immediately. Their shore batteries mounted over 1,000 cannon, and they'd had time to reinforce their positions since Exmouth's first visit in March. Cannonballs smashed into British hulls. Rigging was shot away. Masts were hit. Men were killed at their guns. HMS Impregnable, a 98-gun second rate, took repeated hits from batteries she couldn't effectively engage. HMS Superb's main mast was badly damaged. Smaller ships faced even worse. Their lighter construction made them vulnerable to heavy shore guns. But the British held their positions and maintained fire. This was what Royal Navy ships were built for: sustained, methodical gunnery at close range. Gun crews loaded, fired, reloaded in practiced rhythm, maintaining rates of fire the Algerians couldn't match. British ships could fire 3 broadsides for every 2 the Algerian batteries managed, and British accuracy was superior. Trained Royal Navy gunners hitting specific targets like gun embrasures, magazine entrances and ship holes. The Dutch squadron, positioned on the British left, engaged batteries on that flank with equal determination. Van der Kapelen's flagship, Melampus, fought alongside British ships, her crew proving that Dutch naval courage matched Britain's. Throughout the battle, Dutch and British ships supported each other, sharing the danger and the glory. As the sun began setting, Exmouth's plan started working. Algerian shore batteries were being systematically destroyed. British ships fired red-hot shot. Cannonballs heated until they glowed, then fired into enemy wooden structures to start fires. The Algerian Corsair fleet, moored in the harbour, began burning. Ship after ship caught fire and exploded as flames reached powder magazines. The night sky lit up with enormous explosions, debris raining down across the harbour. The Algerian flagship, a massive frigate mounting 44 guns, became a priority target. British ships concentrated fire on her, and by 7 p.m. she was ablaze. Her crew abandoned ship, and she exploded with a blast that broke windows across the city. Other Corsair ships followed, burned to the waterline by British incendiary fire, or blown apart by direct hits to their magazines. The bombardment continued through the night. British ships fired by the light of burning Algerian vessels, maintaining their positions despite casualties and damage. Exmouth remained on Queen Charlotte's quarterdeck throughout, directing fire and encouraging his crews. When a shot struck nearby, killing several sailors, he calmly ordered the debris cleared and the guns to keep firing. By midnight, Algiers was a scene of devastation. 50 Corsair ships had been destroyed, the entire Algerian fleet. Shore batteries were wrecked, their guns dismounted or buried under rubble. Fires burned throughout the harbour district. The city's water supply had been hit, leaving fires to rage unchecked. And most importantly, the fortifications protecting the slave prisons had been breached. At 1:30 a.m, after 9 hours of continuous bombardment, Exmouth ordered ceasefire. British ships had expended over 50,000 rounds of ammunition. Every ship was damaged, some severely. Casualties were heavy. 128 British dead and 690 wounded. The Dutch had lost 13 dead and 52 wounded, but they'd accomplished their mission. At dawn on August 28th, Exmouth sent another message to the Dey: free the slaves now or the bombardment would resume. This time the Dey capitulated immediately. He'd seen his fleet destroyed, his fortifications wrecked, and his city burning. He had no choice but to surrender. By afternoon, 3,000 Christian slaves were being released from Algerian prisons. British boats ferried them to the fleet. Men, women and children who'd spent years or decades in captivity, now freed by British naval power. Some had been slaves for so long they'd forgotten their native languages. Others wept as they realised they were finally going home. The freed slaves weren't just British. They were Italian, Spanish, Dutch, Sicilian, Neapolitan, citizens of nations that had paid tribute to avoid exactly this outcome. But Britain had freed them anyway, not because they were British subjects, but because it was the right thing to do. Exmouth's fleet remained off Algiers for several more days, ensuring the Dey kept his promises. The terms were clear: all Christian slaves to be freed immediately, no more capturing of Christian ships, and Algiers would pay reparations for years of piracy. The Dey agreed to everything. On September 2nd, Exmouth's fleet sailed from Algiers carrying the freed slaves. The mission was complete. British casualties had been heavy, some ships so damaged they required extensive repairs, but the moral victory was absolute. The bombardment's impact extended far beyond those 3,000 freed slaves. Within months, the other Barbary states, seeing what had happened to Algiers, began releasing their own Christian slaves and signing treaties to end Corsair piracy. Tunis and Tripoli, which had already made limited agreements with Exmouth in the spring, now went further, dismantling their Corsair fleets and abandoning slave-taking. By 1820, Barbary piracy was effectively finished. The system that had terrorized the Mediterranean for 2 centuries collapsed in the wake of one 9-hour bombardment. The final end came in 1830, when France conquered Algiers entirely, but the decisive blow had been struck by Britain in 1816. What made the bombardment of Algiers significant wasn't just the tactical victory, though that was impressive enough. It was what the battle represented: Britain using its naval supremacy to enforce a moral principle on a global scale. This wasn't about trade routes or strategic interests, though those mattered. It was about declaring that slavery was wrong and backing that declaration with force. Critics then and now point out the irony. Britain had only banned its own slave trade 9 years earlier, in 1807, and slavery itself wouldn't be abolished throughout the British Empire until 1833. How could Britain claim moral authority over slavery while still permitting it in its colonies? The answer is complex and uncomfortable. Britain's approach to slavery was evolving, driven by abolitionists who saw each victory, banning the trade, attacking Barbary slavery, eventually abolishing slavery entirely, as steps toward a larger goal. But whatever the complications and contradictions, the fact remains: when European governments wouldn't act against Barbary slavery because they feared the cost, Britain acted. When other nations paid tribute to avoid confrontation, Britain sent a fleet to end the system by force. And when Lord Exmouth had to choose between avoiding casualties and freeing 3,000 slaves, he chose to risk his fleet and his reputation to do what was right. The bombardment of Algiers became a source of immense pride in Britain. Newspapers celebrated Exmouth as a hero. Artists painted dramatic scenes of the battle. British ships wreathed in smoke, Algerian fortifications crumbling, freed slaves being welcomed aboard Royal Navy vessels. The message was clear: Britain's naval power wasn't just for conquest, it was for justice. For the freed slaves, the impact was life-changing. Many had been captive for decades, their families assuming they were dead. Some had children born in slavery who'd never known freedom. When they returned to their home countries, their stories spread, accounts of British sailors risking their lives, not for profit or empire, but to free strangers from chains. The battle also demonstrated something important about naval warfare in the age of sail. Properly handled, ships could engage fortifications and win. Conventional wisdom said shore batteries always beat ships. Forts couldn't sink, they could resupply easily, and they could concentrate fire on ships that had to manoeuvre. But Exmouth proved that well-trained crews, maintained discipline, and aggressive tactics could overcome those advantages. The key was accepting casualties, maintaining position despite damage and using superior gunnery to systematically destroy enemy defences. Every ship in Exmouth's fleet was damaged, some heavily, but none were lost. Every captain held his position throughout 9 hours of bombardment, refusing to retreat despite the danger. And every crew kept firing until ordered to stop, maintaining rates of fire that overwhelmed Algerian defences. That discipline, that courage under fire, that refusal to quit, even when victory seemed uncertain. These were the qualities that made the Royal Navy the most feared fighting force on any ocean, and they were on full display at Algiers. Within a generation, Britain would use this same combination of naval power and moral authority to patrol the world's oceans, hunting slave ships, freeing enslaved Africans, and enforcing abolition on nations that resisted. The West Africa Squadron, Britain's anti-slavery patrol, would free over 150,000 enslaved people over the course of 60 years. It was expensive, dangerous work that cost hundreds of British lives from disease and combat. But Britain did it because the nation believed it was right. The bombardment of Algiers was where that commitment began, where Britain declared that its naval power would be used not just for national interest, but for moral principles, where a fleet sailed into point-blank range of enemy fortifications and fought for 9 hours to free 3,000 strangers from slavery. If this is the kind of history that makes you proud, the battles fought for principle, the victories that freed slaves rather than creating them, the moments when British courage changed the world for the better, then you know what to do. What other British battles should we cover? What other moments when the Royal Navy fought not for conquest, but for justice? Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that made Britain great, told the way they deserved.